The next day at the shop brought more evidence of the changing times. Jorge, John's best HVAC tech for 15 years, was waiting in the office before opening. "I have to quit, Mr. Anderson," Jorge said, his eyes on the floor. "They're reviewing my grandmother's naturalization from 1985. Said my father's citizenship might be invalid, which means mine." He swallowed hard. "I can't risk being here when they come." John thought of all the systems Jorge had installed, all the customers who asked for him specifically. Jorge could diagnose a failing compressor just by sound, had memorized the quirks of every old unit in town. "We can figure something out. Maybe if I talk to—" Jorge shook his head. "My cousin waited too long in Arizona. They took everything, his house, his savings, put his kids in some kind of youth facility while they verified their status. Nobody's seen them since. They're going back generations now, invalidating marriages, birth certificates. Even people born here aren't safe anymore." After Jorge left, John threw himself into work, trying to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of service calls. But every customer brought a new reminder of how things had changed. Mrs. Henderson, whose family had been calling Anderson AC and heat for 3 generations, could only afford patch jobs now. "Insurance won't cover the replacement anymore," she explained, embarrassed. "They're saying our policy won't cover the higher prices for a new unit anymore." Mr. Chen needed his restaurant's walk-in cooler, fixed but couldn't risk shutting down overnight. "They watch businesses like mine now," he said quietly, looking for suspicious patterns. "One wrong move and—" He shrugged, the gesture carrying the weight of generations of learned caution. By the afternoon, John was back in the office. His receptionist was staring out at the window, biting her nails down to a nub. "Hope, is everything okay? You seem upset." "My sister's bakery in Tampa," she said, when John asked if she was okay. "They did an audit yesterday. Found problems with 3 of her employees. They were all Mexican. Sophia was working there for years. The police took them all away in cuffs. My sister, too." The August heat turned John's garage into a sauna, but they kept working. The Mustang's engine was finally back together, though something still wasn't quite right with the timing. Emma sat on her usual workbench, phone in hand, while John and David hunched over the engine compartment. "Try it now," David called. John turned the key, and the engine coughed, sputtered, then died. "Damn," John muttered. "Thought we had it that time." Emma's sharp intake of breath cut through the garage. Both men turned to find her staring at her phone, her face pale. "Emma?" John asked. "What's wrong?" It's the Ramirez family." Her voice shook. "They took them, all of them." David straightened up slowly, wiping his hands. "What do you mean, took them?" "DOD's new citizenship verification program." Emma's fingers flew over her phone. "Maria's posting about it in the church group. They came at dawn, said Mr. Ramirez's citizenship was under review because his grandmother was undocumented when she had his father." John frowned. "That doesn't make sense. Carlos was born here. He's as American as—" "They can't do that," John said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Carlos coaches Little League. His kids were born here. He pays taxes. Like my parents paid taxes for 30 years before they got citizenship." David's voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "Like I did everything the right way. But last week a woman at Publix told me to go back where I came from." John's head snapped up. "Someone said what? Why didn't you tell me?" David shrugged, turning back to the engine. "What's to tell? It's not the first time. Won't be the last." "But that's different," John protested. "You're legal. You did it the right way." "Did I?" David's hands kept working, steady despite the tension in his voice. "Because lately, seems like the right way keeps changing. First it was just undocumented immigrants. Then it was their children. Now they're reviewing naturalizations from the last 20 years for irregularities." Emma's phone buzzed again. "They're taking them to Camp Roosevelt, that new processing facility the DOD built out by the air base." "Processing facility," David echoed. "Nice name for it." John grabbed a wrench, needing something solid to hold on to. "Look, I'm sure there's a reason. They don't just take people without cause." "Really, Dad?" Emma's voice cracked. "Because Maria says they took Mrs. Ramirez too. She's from Minnesota, born and raised. but they're saying her marriage to Mr. Ramirez is void because he wasn't legally a citizen when they got married. Silence filled the garage, broken only by the tick of the cooling engine. John stared at the Mustang's open hood, at the engine they'd spent months rebuilding. Everything had made sense when they started. Take it apart, clean it up, put it back together. Simple, clear. But now, this isn't what I voted for, he said finally. Isn't it? Emma's voice was gentle but firm. When they talked about taking back America, who did you think they were taking it from? David picked up another tool, his movements deliberately casual. You know what the scariest part is? Most of my students don't even seem shocked anymore. It's becoming normal. Every week, another empty desk, another family gone. But they must have done something, John insisted, though his voice wavered. There must be a reason. Yeah, David said softly. He existed. That's becoming reason enough these days. He paused, then added, You know what Carlos said to me last month? Said he was grateful his grandmother wasn't alive to see this. Said at least she died believing in the American dream. John's hands clenched on the wrench. He thought about Carlos helping build the playground, about Mrs. Ramirez's tamales at the church picnic, about their kids in Emma's youth group. He thought about David, who was more brother than friend after 15 years. What? John's voice caught. He cleared his throat and tried again. What can we do? Emma and David exchanged a look. Maria says they're letting church members visit, Emma said carefully. To bring clothes and things. Maybe... John nodded slowly. Yeah, okay. He looked at David, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in months. I'm sorry. About the Publix thing. About all of it. David managed a small smile. I know, hermano, I know. They turned back to the engine, working in silence for a while. Finally, John spoke again, his voice rough. Think we'll ever get this old girl running right? Maybe, David said, reaching for a wrench. But first, we need to figure out what we broke while trying to fix it. February's chill crept through the garage despite the space heater's valiant efforts. Mike stared at the Mustang's engine, trying to make sense of the parts catalog's new prices. Beside him, David whistled low at the numbers. Double what they were last year, John muttered. If you can even find them. Some of these suppliers aren't even operating anymore. Emma looked up from her laptop. Another factory closing? She'd moved back home last month when her scholarship couldn't keep up with tuition increases. The local community college's website was open in another tab. The tariffs, David said, his hands buried in the engine compartment. Nobody can afford to import raw materials anymore. And with half the workforce? He trailed off, but they all knew what he meant. Between the deportations and people fleeing the economic collapse, many businesses had simply shut down. John's phone buzzed. Another supplier saying they couldn't fill his shop's order, third one this week. He'd already had to lay off 2 mechanics, good men with families, the kind of men who'd voted for Jackson, believing in his promises of American prosperity. Found one, Emma said suddenly. Guy in Georgia's parting out a 67. He's got the timing gear we need. What's he asking? John's voice was resigned. Emma winced. $250 plus shipping. Jesus. John ran a hand through his hair, now more gray than brown. That part was $90 last year. Everything's twice as expensive now, David said dryly. Except teaching supplies. Those are 3 times more expensive when you can get them. Districts talking about going to 4-day weeks to save money. John grabbed a wrench, craving the weight of something substantial in his grip. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Jackson said the tariffs would bring manufacturing back, create jobs. Like deporting 12 million people would solve the labor shortage. Emma's voice was gentle but firm. Or like cutting off trade with our biggest partners would lower prices. Emma, John started, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. The numbers didn't lie. His business was barely staying afloat, and he was one of the lucky ones. Main Street looked like a ghost town, half the stores empty. The church food bank, where he volunteered Wednesdays, had lines around the block, mostly middle-class families who'd never needed help before. David's wrench slipped, clanging against the engine block. Sorry, it's getting hard to see in here. He reached for the work light, but it flickered and died. Perfect. Sorry, we are out of batteries, Emma said. They're hard to find. You know they come from China. They're pretty expensive now. John checked his wallet, found it empty except for a Jackson food ration card. The irony wasn't lost on him. Remember when we started this project? Thought we'd have her running by Christmas. Which Christmas? David asked, but his attempt at humor fell flat. They all remembered last Christmas. The small crowd shopping at the stores, the bare grocery shelves, the patriotic austerity speeches on TV. Emma's phone chimed with a news alert. They're expanding Camp Roosevelt again, adding another 10,000 beds. Where are they finding the money for that? David wondered, when they can't even keep schools open 5 days a week. John thought about Carlos Ramirez, still detained after 6 months, about his kids who should have been in David's class this year, about all the small businesses, like his own, that were one bad month away from closing. We could... John started, then stopped, started again. Maybe we could visit this weekend. Take some supplies. David and Emma exchanged a look. They'd been making regular visits to Camp Roosevelt, though Mike had always found excuses not to go. Too busy at the shop, too much work on the Mustang, too many deacons meetings. Yeah, Dad, Emma said softly. We could do that. John nodded, not trusting his voice. He turned back to the engine, but the parts blurred before his eyes. Everything had made sense 2 years ago. Protect American jobs, secure the borders, restore order. Simple solutions that they told me they would fix all the problems. Now he couldn't even fix a damn car. Found another supplier, Emma said after a while. In Mexico. Her voice carried a hint of irony. Parts are cheaper there. If they were still allowed to sell to us. Doesn't matter, John said quietly. Dollar's too weak now anyway. They worked in silence for a while, trying to make do with what they had. The space heater sputtered and died, another victim of the rolling blackouts. In the darkness, the Mustang skeleton looked almost accusatory. You know what Carlos used to say? David's voice cut through the gloom. About classic cars? Said they were like his grandmother's stories about coming to America. Lot of broken parts, lot of hard work, but worth it because you were building something better. John's throat tightened. He thought about his own grandmother's stories, about the Depression, about pulling together, about helping neighbors even when you had nothing yourself. Maybe, he said finally, maybe we've been trying to restore the wrong things. Outside, another military convoy rumbled past, heading toward Camp Roosevelt. But this time, John didn't avoid David's eyes. This time, he held his friend's gaze and saw in it a reflection of his own growing certainty that something had to change. So, Emma said into the darkness, what are we going to do about it? The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility and fear. John looked at the Mustang, at his daughter, at his friend, at the life they were trying to restore, piece by broken piece. We start with what we can fix, he said finally, and work our way up from there. The sun was setting when they heard a car sputter into the driveway, the engine's uneven idle making David wince. That'll be James, he said, wiping his hands. Timing shot on the Civic. Been meaning to look at it, but... Thought you had that Subaru? John asked, remembering the newer car James used to drive to his practice. Had to sell it, David said quietly. Medical board's new insurance requirements, plus with the registration fees doubling for non-traditional households. He shrugged, trying to keep his tone light, but Emma caught the strain in his voice. James appeared in the garage doorway, still in his scrubs, looking tired but brightening at the sight of them. How's the patient? He asked, nodding toward the Mustang. Better than yours from the sound of it, David teased, crossing to kiss his husband hello. Even after 12 years together, Emma noticed they still lit up around each other. You should hear Mrs. Chen's blood pressure when I tell her to take it easy, James said. Speaking of which, he pulled a paper bag from his coat pocket. Her son sent more dumplings, said to share with our other family. John started to protest, but James held up a hand. Doctor's orders. Emma needs protein for all this mechanical work she's doing. Emma grinned. James had been fussing over her diet since she was in middle school when he first noticed her skipping lunches after her mom left. He'd started bringing extra food to David's classroom, casual offerings that somehow always ended up in her backpack. Remember when you tried to teach me to use chopsticks? She asked, accepting a dumpling. At that career day lunch? You stabbed yourself in the thumb, James laughed. Gave me my first patient at the school. And your last, David added. Once the administration found out we were dating. A shadow crossed James's face. Different times then. At least they just asked me not to volunteer anymore. Now they're talking about reviewing all medical personnel who work with children. John looked up sharply. They can't do that. You're a doctor. They can do whatever they want, John, James said softly. Why do you think we sold the Subaru? Need to keep cash liquid just in case. He trailed off, but they all heard the unspoken words. In case we have to leave. David moved closer to his husband, their shoulders touching. Emma remembered when they first started dating, how careful they'd been around John, until the night David's ex-wife tried to use their relationship to get full custody of his kids. John had marched into court, testified that James was the best thing that had ever happened to their extended family. The judge, an old fishing buddy of John's father, had dismissed the case on the spot. Hey, John said suddenly, you know what would help with your electric bills? I could install one of those new smart thermostats I've been saving. Better than letting it go to waste in my shop. James blinked. You'd want... Course we would, Emma chimed in. Family discount, though. And you have to help install it. I barely manage my phone settings, James protested, but he was smiling. About time you learned some practical skills, David said. You're always saying doctors should have hobbies outside of medicine. Pretty sure I meant golf or tennis, James laughed. Not crawling around in attics with ductwork. Too late, Emma declared. You're one of us now. One of us, one of us. Gooba gaba. God help me, James sighed, but his eyes were bright as he watched David and Mike already planning the installation. This was why they stayed, Emma realized. Not just because of the practice James had built or David's students, but because of moments like this. Family pieced together from broken parts, stronger at the connections. The Civic's engine knocked in the driveway, a reminder of harder times ahead. But for now, they had dumplings and plans and each other. Sometimes, Emma thought, that had to be enough.